The dust kicked up by the approaching wagon settled slowly in the afternoon heat, creating a golden haze that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. Sarah pressed her palm against her swollen belly, feeling the life stirring within as the wooden wheels creaked to a halt outside the weathered ranch house. Her mother's voice cut through the desert silence like a blade, sharp and business, like as she spoke to the tall man who emerged from the shadows of the porch. "She's healthy, strong as an ox, and the babies do come winter," Martha said, her weathered hands gripping the wagon's edge. $50, like we agreed. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the exchange, the reality of her situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. At 19, pregnant and unmarried, she had become nothing more than a burden to be sold off to the highest bidder. The father of her child had disappeared into the wind the moment he learned of her condition, leaving her to face the shame and consequences alone. She had begged her mother not to go through with this arrangement, had promised to work harder, to be less of a burden. But Martha's mind was made up. There was no room for sentiment in their harsh world. The rancher, a man named Thomas Callahan, stepped closer to the wagon. His face was weathered by years under the unforgiving sun, deep lines etched around his eyes that spoke of both hardship and wisdom. When he looked at Sarah, she expected to see the same cold calculation she'd witnessed in every man who'd come to inspect her over the past month. Instead, his gray eyes held something she hadn't seen in so long she'd almost forgotten it existed: genuine kindness. There was no judgment in his gaze, no disgust at her condition, only a quiet compassion that made her breath catch in her throat. "Mom," he said, tipping his hat to Sarah before turning back to her mother. "I'll take good care of her. You have my word." Martha pocketed the money without another glance at her daughter. "She's your problem now, Callahan. Don't come looking for refunds when that baby starts crying." She snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, carrying away the only family Sarah had ever known. Not once did Martha look back. Not once did she offer a word of comfort or goodbye to the daughter she was abandoning. The wagon pulled away in a cloud of dust, leaving Sarah standing beside her single carpet bag, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. The weight of abandonment pressed down on her shoulders as she watched the only family she'd ever known disappear into the vastness of the frontier. Her hands trembled as she realized she was now completely at the mercy of a stranger, carrying a child she wasn't sure she could protect. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a reminder of how isolated and vulnerable she truly was. "Come on inside," Thomas said gently, his voice carrying none of the harshness she'd expected. "The sun's getting fierce, and you need rest." The interior of the ranch house was simple but clean, with rough-hewn furniture and windows that let in streams of golden light. Sarah had expected to be shown to servants' quarters or perhaps a barn, but Thomas led her to a modest bedroom with a real bed, complete with quilts and a wash basin. The room smelled of lavender and fresh air, a stark contrast to the cramped, musty quarters she'd shared with her mother in their ramshackle cabin back in town. "This will be your room," he said, setting her bag on the wooden chest at the foot of the bed. "There's fresh water in the pitcher, and dinner's at 6. If you need anything before then, just holler." Sarah stared at him, confusion replacing her earlier fear. "I don't understand. What do you expect of me?" The words came out harsher than she intended, but she'd learned to be suspicious of kindness. In her experience, it always came with a price. Thomas paused in the doorway, his large frame silhouetted against the hallway light. "Right now, I expect you to rest. Tomorrow, we'll figure out how you can help around the ranch, but nothing too strenuous in your condition. The baby comes first." After he left, Sarah sank onto the bed, her hands trembling as she tried to process this unexpected turn of events. She'd prepared herself for the worst backbreaking labor, cruel treatment, perhaps even worse. Instead, she found herself in a comfortable room with a man who seemed to actually care about her well-being. The kindness felt so foreign that she almost didn't trust it. She waited for the other shoe to drop, for him to reveal his true intentions, but as the hours passed, nothing happened. No one came to drag her away or make demands of her. She was simply left to rest, as promised. That evening, Thomas introduced her to the rest of the household. There was Miguel, an older Mexican man who served as the ranch foreman, his weathered hands gentle as he helped serve dinner. His wife Rosa managed the cooking and cleaning, her warm smile immediately putting Sarah at ease. Their teenage son Diego helped with the horses and greeted Sarah with the shy politeness of youth. They welcomed Sarah with genuine warmth, treating her more like family than the purchased commodity she knew herself to be. Segora Sarah. Rosa said as they prepared dinner together, "You must eat well for the baby. I will teach you to make the foods that will keep you both strong." Rosa's kindness brought tears to Sarah's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had shown her such maternal care. Her own mother had grown increasingly cold and distant as Sarah's pregnancy progressed, seeing her only as a problem to be solved rather than a daughter to be supported. Rosa, this stranger, was offering more comfort than Martha had shown in months. The dinner table was warm and welcoming, filled with conversation and laughter. Thomas asked about her journey, her health, her comfort, but never once pressed her for details about her past or the circumstances that had brought her there. Diego regaled them with stories about the wild horses he'd been trying to break, while Miguel shared wisdom about the coming winter and what preparations needed to be made. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to understand that Thomas Callahan's ranch was unlike any place she'd ever known. The work was honest and fairly distributed, with everyone contributing according to their abilities. Thomas never once made her feel like a burden or reminded her of the circumstances that had brought her there. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, often asking for her input on ranch decisions. "You've got a good head for numbers," he said one evening as they reviewed the books together. "Rosa tells me you've been helping her with the supply orders too. You're making this place run smoother than it has in years." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his praise. It had been so long since anyone had valued her for anything other than her ability to bear children or perform menial labor. Here, she was beginning to discover talents she never knew she possessed. She found herself looking forward to each new day, eager to contribute to the running of the ranch. For the first time in her life, she felt useful, valued, wanted. The landscape around the ranch was harsh but beautiful, with rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and distant mountains that changed color throughout the day. Sarah often found herself standing on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The vastness of it all made her feel small, but not insignificant somehow. She felt like she was part of something larger than herself for the first time in her life. Thomas would often join her on these evening vigils, the two of them sitting in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead. Sometimes he would tell her stories about the ranch, about the challenges of frontier life, about his dreams for the future. Other times they would simply sit quietly, both lost in their own thoughts but somehow comforted by each other's presence. As autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah's belly grew round and full. The baby moved constantly now, and she often found herself talking to the little one, sharing her hopes and fears as she went about her daily tasks. She told the baby about the ranch, about the kind people who had taken them in, about the father who would love them both unconditionally even though they shared no blood. Thomas had insisted on bringing in Dr. Henderson from town to check on her regularly, despite the expense. The doctor was a kind man with gentle hands and a reassuring manner who treated Sarah with the same respect he would show any expectant mother. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor assured her during one visit. "This baby's going to be strong and healthy." Dr. Henderson never made her feel judged or ashamed about her unmarried state. His confidence in her and the baby's health helped ease some of the fears that had plagued her since learning of her pregnancy. Under his care and with the support of the ranch family, Sarah began to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would work out after all. That night, Sarah sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Thomas joined her, settling into the chair beside her with a cup of coffee in his hands. "You ever think about what comes after?" he asked quietly. Sarah's hand moved to her belly, feeling the baby's gentle movements. "After the baby comes, I suppose I'll keep working here, if you'll have me. I don't have anywhere else to go." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the last traces of sunlight were fading. "Sarah, I want you to know that this is your home now. Not because of any arrangement with your mother, but because you've become part of this family. When that baby comes, he or she will be welcomed with open arms." Tears stung Sarah's eyes as the full weight of his words sank in. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Thomas set down his coffee cup and turned to face her. "Because everyone deserves a chance at happiness, especially someone as good-hearted as you. I've watched you these past months, Sarah. You've brought light to this place in ways you can't even imagine." The sincerity in his voice broke down the last of the walls Sarah had built around her heart. For the first time since her mother had announced her intention to sell her, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. She had found something she'd never expected to find again: family, belonging, love. The first snows of winter arrived just as Sarah's labor pains began. She woke in the early hours of the morning, her body gripped by a pain unlike anything she'd ever experienced. Rosa was by her side instantly, having moved into the house the week before to be close when the time came. "Easy, Mija," Rosa soothed, helping Sarah through the first contractions. "This little one is ready to meet the world." The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Rosa stayed by Sarah's side throughout, offering encouragement and comfort while Thomas paced the hallway outside, wearing a groove in the wooden floor with his worried steps. Dr. Henderson arrived just as dawn broke over the mountains, his calm presence immediately easing some of Sarah's fear. "You're doing beautifully," he assured her as another contraction gripped her. "Won't be much longer now." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Sarah felt the final overwhelming urge to push. With one last tremendous effort, she brought her daughter into the world. The baby's first cry was strong and clear, filling the room with the sound of new life. Sarah collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but exhilarated, as Dr. Henderson cleaned and examined the baby. "She's beautiful," Thomas said softly, peering down at the tiny, perfect face as the doctor wrapped the baby in a soft blanket. "What will you call her?" Sarah looked at the man who had given her a second chance at life, who had shown her kindness when the world had turned its back on her. The baby in her arms was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, with dark hair and tiny fingers that gripped Sarah's thumb with surprising strength. "Hope," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Her name is Hope. As winter deepened and gave way to spring, Sarah found herself settling into a rhythm of contentment she'd never experienced before. Hope grew strong and healthy, her laughter filling the ranch house with joy. She was a good baby, sleeping through the night early and rarely fussing except when hungry or tired. The whole household doted on her, with Rosa knitting tiny clothes and blankets while Miguel carved wooden toys. Thomas proved to be a natural with children, often spending his evenings teaching the baby to clap her hands or making silly faces to earn her giggles. He would sit for hours holding Hope, reading to her from books or simply talking about the ranch and the animals. Sarah watched these interactions with a growing warmth in her heart, seeing the genuine love that had developed between them. "You're going to spoil her," Sarah teased one evening, watching as Thomas bounced Hope on his knee. "That's what she deserves," he replied, his eyes twinkling as Hope grabbed at his mustache. "This little one is going to know she's loved every single day of her life." Sarah's heart swelled with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize. Over the months, her feelings for Thomas had evolved from gratitude to something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken when he smiled at her or touched her hand in passing. She'd begun to hope that perhaps he felt the same way, but she didn't dare voice her feelings for fear of disrupting the fragile peace they'd built. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The horses had foaled, producing several beautiful colts that would be trained and sold. The garden Rosa had planted behind the house was coming up green and promising. The cattle were thriving on the new grass, and the ranch was showing signs of real prosperity. Sarah found herself helping with all aspects of ranch life, from tending the animals to managing the accounts. She had never felt so useful or so valued. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching Hope play with a wooden toy Thomas had carved for her, he cleared his throat nervously. Sarah noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he set down his coffee cup. "Sarah, I have something I need to tell you," he began, his usually steady voice wavering. "I know this might seem sudden, but I've been thinking about it for months now." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she waited for him to continue. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. She had hoped for this moment but had never quite believed it would come. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you and I love Hope, and I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you both know how precious you are. Would you consider being my wife?" The tears that had been threatening all evening finally spilled over as Sarah reached for his hand. His fingers were warm and calloused from years of ranch work, but they held hers with infinite gentleness. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Thomas. I love you too." They were married in the small church in town on a perfect June morning, with Rosa, Miguel, and Diego standing as witnesses. Hope, now 6 months old and full of personality, gurgled happily in Rosa's arms throughout the ceremony. The whole town had turned out to celebrate, and Sarah was overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance she found in their new community. "You've found yourself a good man," Mrs. Patterson, the school teacher, told her during the reception. "Thomas Callahan is one of the finest men in this territory." Sarah wore a simple white dress that Rosa had sewn for her, with wildflowers in her hair and Thomas's mother's ring on her finger. She had never felt more beautiful or more loved than she did walking down the aisle toward the man who had saved her life in every way that mattered. As they exchanged vows, Sarah felt the last of her fears and doubts melt away, replaced by a joy so pure it took her breath away. As the months turned into years, Sarah's life transformed in ways she'd never dared to dream. She and Thomas welcomed 2 more children together, a son they named Samuel and another daughter, Grace. Each pregnancy was easier than the last, surrounded as she was by love and support. The ranch prospered under their joint care, becoming known throughout the territory for its fine horses and fair dealing. Thomas's reputation for honesty and Sarah's skill with numbers made them sought after partners for business ventures. They expanded their holdings, bought better breeding stock, and hired more hands to help with the growing operation. What had started as a modest ranch became one of the most successful spreads in the territory. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who knew nothing of the circumstances of her birth. To her, Thomas was simply Papa, the man who taught her to ride horses and told her bedtime stories. She had his gray eyes and Sarah's determined chin, with a smile that could light up the darkest day. Her laughter filled the house with music, and her boundless energy kept everyone on their toes. Sarah often marveled at how completely her daughter had been accepted into their family, with no distinction made between her and the children who came later. Samuel, born when Hope was 2, adored his big sister and followed her everywhere. Grace, the baby of the family, was sweet and gentle, with a love for books that reminded Sarah of herself. "Mama, why do you sometimes look so sad when you watch us play?" Hope asked one day when she was 8 years old. Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of sunshine and wildflowers that always seemed to cling to her hair. "Not sad, sweetheart. Grateful. I'm grateful for how blessed we are." It was true. Sometimes the happiness felt almost too much to bear, as if it might be taken away at any moment. But as the years passed, Sarah learned to trust in the permanence of the love that surrounded her. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her family. The ranch became a gathering place for the community. Thomas and Sarah hosted barn dances and holiday celebrations, opened their doors to travelers and neighbors alike. They had built something beautiful together, a place where people felt welcome and valued. Their home became known as a place where anyone could find a meal, a bed, and a sympathetic ear. One autumn evening, as Sarah tucked Hope into bed, her daughter asked about her grandmother. "Papa says she lives far away," Hope said, her voice drowsy with sleep. "Will I ever meet her?" Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people make choices that take them away from the people they love. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. You are loved more than you'll ever know." Hope nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Will you tell me the story about the day I was born again?" Sarah smiled, settling into the familiar rhythm of the bedtime story she'd told countless times. "It was a snowy morning, and Papa was so excited to meet you that he wore a path in the floorboards from all his pacing. When Dr. Henderson finally said you were ready to meet the world, Papa cried tears of joy. It was the truth, just not the whole truth." Sarah had made peace with the editing required to protect her daughter's innocent heart. Hope would know the full story someday, when she was old enough to understand the complexities of adult choices and consequences. As the years passed, Sarah sometimes found herself thinking about her mother, wondering if Martha ever regretted the choice she'd made. She'd heard through travelers that her mother had remarried and moved to California, apparently finding the financial security she'd always craved. Sarah felt no desire to reach out, no need for closure or reconciliation. The woman who had sold her like livestock was a stranger now, connected to her only by blood and bitter memory. "Do you ever miss her?" Thomas asked one night as they sat by the fire, watching their children play. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I miss having a mother," she said finally. "But I don't miss her, if that makes sense. A real mother wouldn't have done what she did." Thomas nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. For what it's worth, I think you've broken that cycle. Look at how you love our children, there's nothing conditional about it. Sarah's heart swelled with pride and love as she watched Hope patiently help little Grace with her letters, while Samuel built elaborate structures with wooden blocks. Her children would never know the fear of abandonment that had shaped her own childhood. They would grow up secure in the knowledge that they were wanted, loved, and valued unconditionally. When Hope turned 16, a young man named Daniel Morrison began calling on her. He was the son of a neighboring rancher, polite and hardworking, with kind eyes that reminded Sarah of Thomas. Daniel's family had a good reputation in the territory, known for their honesty and fair dealing. As she watched her daughter laugh at something Daniel had said, Sarah felt a bittersweet pang of recognition. She's growing up, Thomas observed, following her gaze. She is, Sarah agreed. But she's growing up knowing she's loved. That makes all the difference. Daniel was a good match for Hope. He was patient with her questions, respectful of her opinions, and clearly adored her. He treated her with the same consideration Thomas had always shown Sarah, and she could see that Hope was blossoming under his attention. When he asked for her hand in marriage, Thomas and Sarah gave their blessing gladly. That evening, as Sarah brushed Hope's long hair before bed, her daughter looked at her in the mirror. "Mama, I know there are things about my early life that you haven't told me," Hope said quietly. "And I want you to know that I don't need to know everything. You and Papa are my parents in every way that matters." Sarah's hand stilled in her daughter's hair as tears pricked her eyes. "How did you get so wise?" Hope smiled, reaching up to cover her mother's hand with her own. "I learned from the best." Years later, as Sarah stood in the same church where she'd married Thomas, watching Hope exchange vows with Daniel, she felt a deep sense of completion. Her daughter was radiant in the wedding dress Rosa had spent months sewing, her face glowing with the same joy Sarah had felt on her own wedding day. The church was packed with friends and neighbors, all there to celebrate the union of two young people who had found love in each other. "Are you crying, Mama?" Samuel, now 12 and self-conscious about displays of emotion, whispered. "Happy tears," Sarah whispered back, pulling him close. "These are definitely happy tears." At the reception, Thomas found her sitting quietly on the porch, watching their guests celebrate inside. The sounds of laughter and fiddle music drifted out through the open doors, mixing with the evening sounds of the ranch. The celebration would continue late into the night, with dancing and storytelling, and the kind of joy that only came from a community coming together. "Thinking deep thoughts?" he asked, settling beside her. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, marveling at how solid and dependable he still felt after all these years. "I was thinking about how different things could have been. If you hadn't been the man you are, if you'd treated me like property instead of a person." Thomas lifted her chin so she was looking at him. "But I did see you as a person, Sarah. From the very first moment. You were never property to me, you were a gift. A gift I never deserved but was grateful to receive." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Inside, they could hear Hope's laughter mixing with the sounds of celebration, surrounded by the love of family and friends. "No regrets?" Thomas asked softly. Sarah thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment, the pain of abandonment, the fear of an uncertain future, the gradual healing that had come through unexpected kindness. She thought about the woman who had sold her and the man who had chosen to love her, about the children who had never known want or uncertainty, about the life she'd built from the ashes of her old one. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Not a single one." As the night wore on and the last guests departed, Sarah found herself alone with Hope for a few precious minutes. Her daughter, still radiant in her wedding dress, hugged her tightly. "Thank you, Mama," Hope whispered, "for everything, for the love, for the home, for showing me what a real family looks like." Sarah held her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair one last time before she belonged fully to someone else. "You were my salvation, Hope. The moment I held you in my arms, I knew everything was going to be all right." Years continued to pass, bringing their share of joys and sorrows. Sarah and Thomas celebrated the births of grandchildren, weathered droughts and harsh winters, and watched their children grow into adults who carried forward the values of love, acceptance, and second chances. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming a beacon of hope and stability in an often harsh and unforgiving land. When Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Sarah felt as though half of her heart had been torn away. But even in her grief, she was surrounded by the family they'd built together, Hope and Daniel with their 3 children, Samuel and his wife with their 2 little ones, and Grace, now a schoolteacher herself, who had chosen to remain close to home. "He was the best man I ever knew," Hope said at the funeral, her voice strong despite her tears. "He showed us all what it means to love without conditions, to see the best in people, to give second chances." Sarah nodded, thinking of the scared, pregnant girl who had stepped off that wagon so many years ago. Thomas had seen something in her that she hadn't even seen in herself: potential, worth, the capacity for love and growth. He had nurtured those qualities with patience and kindness until they bloomed into something beautiful. In the months that followed, Sarah found comfort in her routines around the ranch. She still kept the books, still helped Rosa with the cooking, still told bedtime stories to her grandchildren. The pain of losing Thomas was a constant ache, but it was tempered by gratitude for the years they'd shared and the legacy they'd created together. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Hope joined her. "I have something to tell you," Hope said, settling into the chair that had been Thomas's. "Daniel and I are expecting again." Sarah's face lit up with joy. "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful news. If it's a boy," Hope continued, "we're going to name him Thomas." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she reached for her daughter's hand. He would be so proud. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Sarah reflected on the strange and winding path that had brought her to this place. She had been sold like property, abandoned by the woman who should have protected her, thrown into an uncertain future with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby in her womb. But that abandoned girl had found something. She never could have imagined a love that transformed everything it touched. A family that chose each other not because of blood, but because of bonds forged in kindness and commitment. She had learned that healing was possible, that the deepest wounds could become sources of strength, and that sometimes the most beautiful chapters of life began with the most painful ones. The ranch that had once seemed like a prison had become a sanctuary, not just for her but for anyone who needed a second chance. Over the years, she and Thomas had taken in other lost souls, drifters looking for work, women fleeing bad situations, children who needed homes. They had created a place where people could start over, where the past didn't define the future. Now, as Sarah prepared to pass the ranch on to her children, she knew that legacy would continue. Hope and Daniel were already talking about expanding the operation, creating more opportunities for people who needed fresh starts. The healing that had begun with one pregnant girl and one kind-hearted rancher would ripple outward through generations. As she rose to go inside, Sarah paused to look back at the vast expanse of desert and mountain that stretched beyond the ranch borders. Somewhere out there, her mother might still be alive, might occasionally wonder about the daughter she'd sold and the grandchildren she'd never know. Sarah felt no bitterness toward her anymore, only a deep sadness for all the love Martha had chosen to throw away. But that was Martha's loss, not hers. Sarah had learned that family wasn't about blood or biology, it was about choice. Thomas had chosen to love her when she was unlovable, to see her worth when she couldn't see it herself. Her children had chosen to embrace the story of their family, with all its complications and imperfections, and she had chosen to let go of the pain of the past in order to fully embrace the joy of the present. As she turned off the lamps and prepared for bed, Sarah whispered a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected twists of fate that had brought her to this life. She had been sold as property, but had discovered she was priceless. She had been abandoned but had found a home. She had been broken but had been made whole again through the healing power of unconditional love. The ranch settled into quiet as the last light faded from the windows. In the morning, there would be work to do, meals to prepare, grandchildren to tend. But tonight, Sarah slept peacefully, surrounded by the love she had helped to create and secure in the knowledge that healing was always possible, even when it seemed impossible to imagine. The girl who had arrived in that dusty wagon had become a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest trials, and that love, when it's real and true, has the power to transform everything it touches. She had found her place in the world, her purpose, her family, and most importantly, she had found herself.